to another episode of Spark Talk. Today we are once again discussing Cuba. 2 days ago, the US government indicted former president of Cuba, Raul Castro, and 5 others on conspiracy to kill US nationals, specifically when Cuban Air Force jets shot down 2 planes operated by US-based Cuban exile group Brothers to the Rescue in February 1996, so 30 years ago. Now, Raul Castro is in his 90s, I believe. These charges are from 1996, a whole 30 years ago. So anyone who has a clue about the US-Cuba relationship will be able to see this for what it is, a clear upping of the offensive that Trump has unleashed on Cuba. The same day, the US government slapped 30-year-old charges against Castro, the USS Nimitz officially arrived in the Caribbean Sea. The situation is tense. Cuba, already squeezed due to the decades-long blockade, is facing ever more difficulties as the Trump government put sanctions on all countries selling oil to Cuba earlier this year. So, to discuss the situation in more detail and what internationalists can and should do to defend Cuba and beat back US imperialism, I am joined by Comrade John Masters. Hi, John.
Hi, Mansa. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Good.
Thank you for making the time to talk to us about Cuba this time. Previously, it was about South Korea, but we're going to do a bit more in-depth discussion on Cuba. We've done a number of episodes in the recent couple of months on Cuba, fundraising for Cuba, the defense of Cuba. I think one episode we did was on Mexico and why it's important to fight to double the oil shipments to Cuba. But I think today I want to step back and do a bit more broader take on, I guess, the first question, which is why, as communists, it's important to defend Cuba.
Well, the short answer to that is Cuba is the first and only country in the Americas to have successfully overthrown capitalism and establish a worker state with a planned economy. So it's necessary to defend Cuba both as part of our overall opposition to U.S. imperialist attacks anywhere, and very specifically because its overthrow at the hands of U.S. imperialism would be a massive step backwards, not just for the workers and peasants on the island, but for struggles of working people throughout Latin America and beyond. It would be a really terrible defeat. Mm-hmm. So that's a short answer to your question.
Yeah, concise. Okay, I guess I want to start by asking you to, partly for my own benefit as well, but for some of the younger audiences listening, can you tell us a little bit about the Cuban Revolution to provide a basis for the discussion? Because, of course, Cuba's been under a blockade for decades now, and its dire situation is directly a result of it. But we also have a perspective for Cuba that differs very much from its government as well. So I want to lay the groundwork for understanding what the Cuban Revolution is or was in order to then be able to explain why we don't actually politically support the politics of the Cuban government.
Okay. Well, the Cuban Revolution happened in 1959. There was a deeply corrupt, mafia-linked, effectively dictatorship on the island, which served as a source of profits and also kind of a playground for U.S. imperialism up to that date. There was deep anger in whole sections of the population at both Cuba's national oppression and the oppression of its worker and peasant masses. So there was a guerrilla war waged by forces led by Fidel Castro, Raul Castro's brother, although Raul Castro was personally involved in this as well, along with Che Guevara. People will know your listeners will know a number of the names. And although they initially had a perspective of finding a so-called progressive national wing of the Cuban capitalist class to ally with, such a wing really didn't exist. The Cuban bourgeoisie was defeated, and the remnants fled to Miami, to Florida. And in the aftermath, the Cuban economy was reorganized along the lines of a socialized economy with central planning. And the Soviet Union, which of course then existed as by far the strongest of the worker states internationally, provided very significant economic aid as well as military protection to Cuba, which, speaking broadly, is what allowed the revolution to develop, survive, and achieve very major gains, despite being only 90 miles away from the U.S. mainland over roughly the next 30 years. So that's sort of the first period. I can give some examples, if you like, of the gains of the planned economy.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks to the planned economy, Cuba was able to develop an advanced healthcare system, free to all. It has had, and in fact still has, the highest doctor-to-patient ratio in the entire world.
Wow.
Infant mortality and life expectancy became much better than in the United States or even Western Europe, despite the overall poverty of the country. Medical schools, indeed all education, became free, including for foreign students. Cuba helped to train doctors and other healthcare personnel from throughout the global South. And Cuban armed forces were also mobilized to assist some progressive struggles elsewhere, most notably in Angola, starting in the late 1970s, when they defended a left nationalist government against forces allied to U.S. imperialism and the racist South African apartheid rulers. And none of this would have really been possible without the smashing of capitalist class rule and planning of the economy, which, despite distortions, which we can get into a little later, allowed for a certain rational development of the society in the interests of the worker and peasant masses. Good.
So, yeah, I think the point about Cuba's healthcare system is one of the most widely known gains of the Cuban Revolution, for sure. There's on the left, you will have tendencies calling Cuba socialist. Now, earlier in your introduction, you called it a worker state. I want you to speak a little bit about your take on that. Do we call Cuba a socialist country or a state, or yes or no? And why not?
Short no, but I'm trying to avoid abstract Marxist jargon as much as possible to explain things to listeners, especially who are new to this. But socialism, as defined by Marx, Engels, Lenin, the sort of historical leaders of this, requires a advanced international division of labor and economic development, such as that the economic forces can really surpass even the most advanced capitalist countries in the U.S., Western Europe, etc. And therefore, it requires a global, or at least very international scope. Short of that, you have societies that did smash capitalist class rule, the Soviet Union being obviously the biggest example, but also Cuba, China, Vietnam, a few others, which are able to make tremendous gains, but are sort of in transition. They're not capitalist, not yet able to achieve what we would call socialism. And we define, as did Lenin, such societies as worker states. That's a popular phrase for another phrase that some of your listeners may be familiar with, the dictatorship of the proletariat. That was the case with the Soviet Union, both in the early revolutionary period under Lenin and Trotsky, and even later after there'd been a kind of bureaucratic political degeneration under Stalin. And that's the kind of society that Cuba remains and has been since 1959, one in transition between capitalism and socialism, but transitions can go in both directions. And as we saw in the case of the Soviet Union, we can maybe talk about this a little more later, things went backwards. Capitalism was restored. So that's why, again, I don't want to get too hung up on the definitions or precise jargon, but that's why we think it's incorrect to call Cuba a socialist society as opposed to a form of a worker state.
I appreciate both the precision, but also not to speak in abstractions and jargon. I do appreciate that. I guess my one motivation for going there was to arrive, as we work towards laying out why to defend Cuba, which I think is a more easier argument, but exactly how. How do you fight to defend Cuba? I think it's important to understand what the attitudes of communists should be towards the government, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'll give a historical example. The Trotskyist movement, that's our movement, stood for the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, even when it was led by Joseph Stalin, who was literally murdering Trotskyists and betraying many of the gains of the revolution. Why? Because we understood that the Soviet Union embodied the first worker state in the world and was a totally different model of how to organize society, despite the bureaucratic distortions and betrayals, than the US, Western Europe, the imperialist countries. Now, the same applies to Cuba. I don't want to say Cuba today is the same as Stalin's Soviet Union. There's many differences which we could address a little later, but it's the same type of society. For us, defense of the Cuban Revolution does not equal support to or agreement with the particular policies of the ruling Cuban Communist Party leadership, with which we would actually have many criticisms and believe that errors by this leadership have actually contributed to the present terrible situation we see in Cuba.
Yeah, I think that's where it gets difficult.
Right.
For the left. I'm thinking here specifically, our listeners might know we recently had a debate here in Britain, and one of the points of contention there, the debate was on the question of how to fight imperialism. And it was with this group called the Revolutionary Communist Group, very committed anti-imperialists, and they defend Cuba. And however, our difference on Cuba emerges precisely on the question of what approach to take. That, of course, Cuba's been under a blockade for decades. So how can you blame the government when it's in fact the imperialists squeezing the country, and more specifically an island country? So how could you possibly assign blame to the government? Moreover, a government that's actually trying to construct the socialist project, that's trying to, and has in fact in its history made many gains for its people, but also for the international struggle, as you pointed to Angola previously. So I guess that's where the point of contention arises. And I was wondering if, to go back to the question of the government, you say, it has responsibility in terms of where the Cuban Revolution finds itself today. So I want to kind of understand, because Cuba is 90 miles away from the US. It has been completely squeezed and drained by imperialism. So does it not make us sound like the bad guys when we're pointing the finger at the Cuban government saying, hey, you're not doing things right?
Well, okay. First of all, just to emphasize, the main point is to oppose imperialism and mobilize anti-imperialist struggle to defend Cuba. If you're not doing that, any criticism of the Cuban government is indeed, I'm looking for a stronger word than hypocritical, but it's totally wrong.
You're aiding the opposite camp, yeah.
Yes. So let me just emphasize that in first. All the criticisms that we would make of policies of the Cuban regime are in that framework. We fully recognize that the central thing that has led to distortions in the Cuban economy, that's led to inability to transcend a certain level of economic development, the central thing is U.S. imperialism. So please take that as a framework for the comments that I can go on to make. Now, as I said, so maybe I can go through a little bit of concretes, because the best way to answer that is to look at what's really happened in Cuba. Now, if I can speak personally for a moment, my companion and I visited Cuba many times, starting way back in 1988, when the Soviet Union still existed. And we saw the real gains of the revolution, some of the ones that I described earlier. We also, on little things, noted that the small amount of tourists who came into the country were given trips to places like Playa Giron, which is the Bay of Pigs, to see the museum and the monument to struggles of the Cuban people to defeat imperialism. So things like that were quite admirable. However, we also saw in later trips, especially, the impact of the economic collapse that followed the Soviet counter-revolution. I didn't mention the time on this earlier, but the Soviet Union was destroyed in 1990, 1991. And even before that, the bureaucratic rulers of the Soviet Union had started to massively cut off aid. So Cuba basically, by the early 1990s, entered into a period of major economic crisis. It was the phrase that was used in Cuba was the special period. Things went backward economically, and a number of things began to happen. You began to get the dollarization of the economy, that is, a dual monetary system with the US dollar or an equivalent being heavily used. You began to get a real rise of inequalities in what had earlier been a poor but pretty equal society. And you also began to get a big growth of the black market, all within the framework of a decision by the Cuban leadership to try to kickstart the economy through a massive expansion of the tourism industry. So around 1992, I think it was, we visited, there's a coastal city about a couple of hours from Havana called Varadero, which has a big beach, and at that point, a handful of hotels. And before the revolution, it had been sort of a playground for the Cuban elite and the mafia-connected U.S. patrons. But in an attempt to get the economy moving again, the Cuban rulers, at this point it was still under Fidel Castro centrally, they began a program of mass hotel construction. The aim was to attract foreign investment in the form of joint ventures and bring in vastly more tourists who in turn would have foreign currency that could be used to revive the economy. And dozens of these luxury resorts were eventually built. This is the time when the dual currency system was introduced. I maybe need to explain that. It's a little hard to follow sometimes. Workers would be paid in Cuban pesos, but there was very little to be able to buy with Cuban pesos because the economy had gone backwards. So a new currency pegged to the American dollar was introduced initially just for tourists. And then you could use it to buy services, get scarce goods in special stores, etc. But what was initially announced as a temporary measure, it became entrenched. It really never has gone away. Cuban citizens naturally sought to get their hands on the new currency, which was called a convertible peso, or CUC in popular language, so they could get goods amid widespread scarcity. And you started getting the phenomenon of doctors, engineers, other highly trained professionals quitting their jobs to work as tour guides or hotel chambermaids, so you can get tips, so you can get some hard currency. And you started to get a big social differentiation opening up in what, as I said, had earlier been a quite equal society, essentially based on who did and did not have access to this convertible currency based on the dollar. So now by the 2000s, there was a bit of an economic recovery that was fueled in large part by cheap oil imports from Venezuela. This was under the government of Hugo Chavez. And in exchange, Cuba sent thousands of medical and educational personnel to Venezuela to improve their health system, assist in literacy campaigns, and these programs were extended elsewhere in Latin America and beyond. And Cuba also began to get some assistance from China, which became its main trade partner, imports initially of things like buses and bicycles. And there was also investment in tourism from imperialist countries like Spain. Now, let me emphasize some of these measures, like the International Medical Program, are actually quite admirable. Some others, like the joint ventures with imperialist companies in tourism and to develop other sectors like nickel mining, where you could argue they were kind of a necessary evil at the time to revive a collapsed economy. The problem is it became entrenched and the deep structural problems remained and then became exacerbated by government policies over subsequent decades that were really contrary to the interests of the Cuban masses. I'll just give a couple of examples. You're getting fancy resorts everywhere. Meanwhile, spending on agriculture and infrastructure simply collapsed. Havana, not exactly in ruins, that's an overstatement, but things just began collapsing, not working. You started getting the phenomenon of luxury tourist hotels literally sitting next door to dilapidated poor districts of the cities. The sort of thing you see in many parts of the global south for those who've traveled there. But unlike in, the Dominican Republic or Jamaica, in Cuba, this was called socialism. And so you started getting a lot of deep disaffection, especially among younger Cubans. People who had no direct knowledge of what Cuba was like before the revolution, but only saw, scarcity and inequality. And waves of these mainly younger Cubans started leaving, trying to get to the U.S. The most recent exodus saw close to 2 million people. That's about 15% of the population left starting around 2019. And for those who remained, opposition to the government and its policies grew. Now, some of this certainly was fueled by U.S. imperialism and its propaganda, but much of it grew out of just despair over poverty and inequality. Then you get the Obama administration, where there was some loosening of the embargo, and a lot of Americans started going to Cuba for the first time. But if you look more broadly, all it did was reinforce the government's reliance on tourism as the way to get to get the economy going forward. You're getting fancy restaurants in Havana. The knock-on effects did lead to some economic improvement for poor Cubans for a while, but the social differentiation just grew and grew. If you had relatives in Miami who could send you money, or if you had connections to the black market, you could open private businesses and you could live vastly better than most Cubans. And then you get Trump. So his first administration restored all the sanctions that Obama loosened a little. Then you had the pandemic, the total collapse of the tourist industry. Around the same time, the government, by this point led by the current president, Diaz-Canel, it introduced another monetary reform. It eliminated this thing, the kook, the convertible peso, but it had tried to merge the currencies. But it was so botched that in reality, the U.S. dollar took over as the real main currency in Cuba. Ever larger numbers of private businesses were allowed to open, and the inequalities, frankly, became a chasm. Biden did nothing to reverse the sanctions, and when Trump came in again, as we see today, he's moving quickly now to try to brutally starve Cuba into submission. And part of what they're playing on is genuine grievances about inequalities among the population, which they try to twist in a reactionary pro-imperialist direction. It's a short summary, but kind of showing how the policies pursued by the government have not served to defend and push forward the revolution, but have actually contributed to creating a social crisis.
Yeah, I appreciate you laying out that overall trajectory. I want to actually push on that point because you use this phrase, which I think describes it well. Tourism, sort of increasing investment in tourism as maybe a necessary evil, right?
Yeah.
The joint ventures. And then you said that it's not so much that this was done. Of course, we know in the history of worker states, the Soviet Union, China, et cetera, that is okay. It's permissible. It's not it's not a moral question. It happens. But the problem, as you mentioned, is that it became entrenched. I.e., instead of being time-limited compromise to achieve a certain aim, it became part of how that economy started to function and therefore contributed to inequalities as you laid out. Now, I guess that's where the difficulty arises, because if we take issue with the outlook and the policies of the Cuban government and, that it led to entrenchment of these practices and these policies, what somebody could easily answer saying, well, they didn't have a choice. Look, they're totally isolated. The Soviet Union is no more. There's immense imperialist pressure. What else would you have done? I guess what would be our answer to...
Well,
yeah.
Sorry. Well, I can do that in broad strokes.
Yeah.
Among trips that I've done to Cuba, a lot of them are in agricultural area, like sometimes to a tourist resort, but it's in an agricultural area. Agriculture's collapsed in Cuba. Now, some of that was inevitable that it went backward. They used to have tractors in the Soviet period. You're no longer getting cheap fuel from Russia, so they went back to using oxen in the field. So it was like going back decades or even centuries in terms of technology. That couldn't have been helped. But what happened is instead of pursuing policies that could lead to, maybe initially at a gradual level, reinvest in agriculture to get it going again so that the Cuban economy could come a lot closer to being able to feed its own population. Instead, agriculture, like infrastructure in the cities, was collapsed, was starved of investment. So the balance between massive investment in the tourism industry, producing what are now these half-empty luxury resorts all over, even before the current period, tourism had collapsed 6-7 years ago to a large extent. Instead of putting all your eggs in that basket, moreover, a basket that in itself allowed inequalities to grow, there should have been a very different balance in the economic development in terms of investment in agriculture, investment in infrastructure. I mean, the big problem of the 20 to 24-hour blackouts every day is the U.S. has blocked any oil for going to Cuba. That's the fundamental thing. It also has to be said that the power plants they have in Cuba, the infrastructure is so outdated. Some of it precedes the revolution. Others are from the Soviet period. And there was no sort of attempt or no plan to find a way to have a portion of the national income, significant portion, used to reinvest to build that up. So things could have been done very different economically. There's also at a political level. Now, the suppression, we're for workers' democracy. That means democratic rights for all who support the revolution and the basic gains of a socialized economy. And there should be full scope for debate, differences, etc. Now, Cuba's not North Korea or something like that. I don't want to do a caricature of it. But in Cuba as well, there has been suppression of what you could call dissident socialist voices. There's many examples. One of the more recent was I think he was just a professor of architecture at one of the Havana universities who wrote a piece criticizing the government, and he was fired from his job. Now, if it was just one isolated thing, okay, but it's been common. And the absence of genuine workers' democracy, allowing for dissident voices who would point a different way forward for the revolution, has also massively contributed, we believe, to the real problems in Cuba. Instead, it's kind of an entrenched bureaucratic caste in the society that makes the decisions, good or bad. And the problem is, lately, we strongly believe a great deal of them have been bad.
There's a phrase that you've used a number of times, which is push the revolution. You know, that the policies of the government, instead of pushing the revolution forward, they've instead undermined it. I'm paraphrasing now, but you use that phrase, which I want to take that to another political level, which is a whole question of how do you fight back imperialism, right? Like, Cuba has been a complete thorn in the side of the United States, and that is where, you know, Castro and those who led the revolution, but today also Cuba and the Cuban government gets its authority from, that it is standing up to the US. Right. However, that's changed over the years, but that it's anti-imperialist. But I believe even with its own policies, there's anti-imperialism and then there's anti-imperialism.
Right.
I'm not familiar with Cuba very much at all, but in some of the recent stuff we've written on China, for example, I believe some of those criticisms would be equally valid here, which is that it's the CPC's political strategy of not seeking to mobilize the working class of the world in a struggle against US imperialism, which is what's desperately needed. Would you agree that that's a similar criticism we could level at the Cuban government, that it's not appealing to the masses of the world? Or maybe it is, I don't know. But I guess on an international level, how would you make sense of its anti-imperialist?
No, I would agree with that summary. The early days of the revolution, I think in this podcast, probably not a lot of time to go into this in detail, but you did get a lot more talk about we need 2, 3, many Vietnams. This is referring to the Vietnamese Revolution that was then going on. Certainly the rhetoric and even probably the subjective anti-imperialist spirit of the leadership in Cuba was much stronger. That's largely gone. I don't want to, again, be one-dimensional and say they never talk about opposing imperialism. Of course, that's not true.
Right.
You get speeches about this all the time. But what in practice does Cuba do? Even allowing for the poverty, even allowing for the limitations, which are a lot more than what, say, China could do. They do some stuff, yes, that's admirable, like the medical missions abroad. That's good. But what's Cuba's attitude to the struggles of working people in other countries? And here I want to mainly talk about the so-called progressive countries. So take in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, earlier Venezuela. Essentially, their attitude is being just support the progressive governments and try to have more progressive capitalist governments, and that's the way forward. And there was a long history of when you'd have what we think were potential openings for socialist revolution based on the working class in Latin America, Chile in the early 1960s, Nicaragua in the 1980s. The Cuban leadership's policy was often to express caution. Don't do what we did. Don't go too far. And now if you look at today, what's needed? Okay. As you mentioned, we participated in the Nuestra America Flotilla, helped to get some material aid into Cuba, along with a whole lot of other groups. That's good. I mean, I think the Cubans appreciated it. More of that's needed. But frankly, it's a drop in the bucket. What they need immediately to survive, above all, is oil, fuel. And you've got countries in Latin America like Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela before the U.S. attack that have oil. They could supply it, but they're not. They're bowing to U.S. imperialist diktats. And they send some rice or some other aid, fine. But they're not doing what's obviously needed. And what is the Cuban government saying? They're just thanking the Mexican government or the Colombian government or the Brazilian government when they send the aid. They're not raising a hue and cry about we need this. We need the fuel desperately, calling on, let's say, Mexican workers or Brazilian workers to take action themselves against the policies of their own government to ensure oil can get to Cuba. That's a concrete example of what we might call in our jargon forging an anti-imperialist alliance that can mobilize the toiling masses against imperialism, and in this case, in defense, real concrete material defense of the Cuban Revolution. And then there's also the role of China, which is being Cuba's main trading partner. China's role, I think we've written about this, has to be characterized as criminal over Cuba. You know, it doesn't have oil to export, okay, but it could do many, many other things to seriously aid the Cuban Revolution beyond, selling some solar panels and some shipments of rice. Fine, that's fine, and some diplomatic protests. What the Chinese Communist Party leaders are not doing is providing the massive aid they're fully capable of doing, sending brigades to rebuild the infrastructure, making clear they're going to use their economic might to stand up to U.S. imperialism in defense of Cuba, not to appease Trump. And what do the Cuban leaders do? They just praise their Chinese counterparts, not demand they do what needs to be done. So on the level of foreign policy, if you will, of what's needed to defend Cuba, yes, there's talk about anti-imperialism, and that it's probably sincere among many of the Cuban leaders. But in
Mhm.
practice, the policies are such that cannot confront and defeat imperialism, but instead end up appeasing it, mainly via looking for progressive wings of capitalists abroad, whether they be in Mexico or Brazil, or in the US, the Democrats like Obama. They'd really like to get an
Mhm.
Obama back, even though the Democratic Party has been just as involved in all the attacks on Cuba over the years.
So you've mentioned just a series of countries here, some with the quote
Examples, yeah,
progressive governments. Won't count Delcy Rodriguez in there now, but
right,
the sort of Latin American countries who could
yeah.
be doing something to materially aid Cuba at the moment, but are not. Then there's China. That's a separate question. I don't want to get into that per se right now. But then I guess my question would be, or somebody listening could be thinking, well, why isn't the Cuban government doing what's so desperately needed? It's obvious that they should be putting more pressure on their, diplomatic partners and allies, the Scheinbaum in Mexico or China for that matter. Why isn't it doing that when it's so very obvious that Trump and Marco Rubio want to very clearly oust their regime? Yeah.
Well, at some level, the Cuban regime wants just to survive. Unfortunately, what they're presently focused on, yeah, there's some rhetoric, yes, of course, and I'm sure they obviously don't want to be overthrown by Trump and have the Cuban society ruined even more by the restoration of capitalism. But what they're doing is spending their time negotiating with U.S. imperialism. I think you might have mentioned at the beginning, among the latest U.S. provocations was they just sent in the head of the CIA to quote negotiate
Mhm.
unquote with Cuban government
The
representatives.
CIA does not
Literally, I
negotiate
mean,
with anybody.
they generally don't, and also they generally don't even announce where they're going.
Uh-huh.
But very publicly, they sent the head of the CIA along with a delegation into Havana, basically to lay down U.S. terms for surrender. And there they are, sitting across the table from each other, the two delegations. And it started with the CIA director saying, okay, here's our terms. Cuba must completely break with China and Russia,
Mhm.
massively liberalize the economy. Liberalize simply means turn it over to private capitalists. Um, and these so called negotiations really amount to one thing: a demand that Cuba's communist leaders be replaced by capitalist ones. There was even a story I read in the media today that among the U.S. delegation was a paramilitary operative who was personally involved in the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Maduro in January, during which 32 Cuban security personnel were killed. And the
Mm.
CIA director made a point of telling the Cuban delegation that this guy sitting beside me here killed your people in Caracas. So
Mm.
the provocations are endless. And the problem is that the Cuban government keeps negotiating and making concessions. I know there's a gun to their head, but that does not justify things like Diaz-Canel talking about the need to come to a mutually agreeable solution that can defend the interests of both our nations. It doesn't
Mm.
include the Cuban government agreeing to massive concessions like an almost open-ended allowance now for Cuban capitalist exiles in Florida to open private businesses in Cuba. And what we say is these negotiations are a real trap. And rather than the Cuban leaders saying that we may be forced to sit down with these guys, but this is a trap, they're going along with this, and it's already weakening the revolution and cannot provide any way for struggle to actually defend Cuba against the U.S.'s obvious total determination to just destroy the revolution in the short run. And let me make one other point on that. There's a number of ways that the U.S. could do this.
Mhm.
It's clearly things are going to come to a head very relatively soon in terms of the U.S. drive against Cuba. It could be an invasion. It could be sustained air strikes, an attempt at a more surgical strike, like in Venezuela, or attempts to foment a counter-revolution or revolt, or some mixture of those. But the U.S. could also decide to keep ratcheting up the pressure in the hope that a wing of Cuba's government will capitulate. I just think we can't rule that out. They're looking for elements that would capitulate and try to come over. And those who simply say we kind of have to give a blank check to the Cuban leadership, I think are living in a fantasy world of thinking that this could not happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots in what you said there. I think for me, the sense I'm getting is that in order to defend the Cuban Revolution, which is in grave danger at the moment, it's necessary to wage a political struggle against the Cuban government. Would that be correct?
Yes, yeah. That would be on the basis of fighting for actual anti-imperialism.
Right. That again, to clarify, means we continue to defend Cuba, defend the Cuban Revolution, and defend the government when it's under attack.
Absolutely, and repeat again and again that the main problem is U.S. imperialism. Not the policies of the bureaucracy.
Precisely. And now I think stepping back, I appreciate you've laid out the bigger picture, including, the contradictions, which there are, of course, many. And of course, it's a small island nation, which is completely squeezed. But within that, how do we, and revolutionaries everywhere in the world, because Cuba is a huge source of inspiration for leftists everywhere, how do we concretely try and fight for this battle, which is, right here? It's facing us right now. I mean, of course, there's the question of material aid, which is an ongoing question. Yes, fine. What would your answer be to what can the left do internationally? The left, which, of course, as always, it just continues to be divided on every question, including Cuba.
Right.
How do you defend it? Do you back the government? Do you not? Etc. So, what would be your answer to our listeners on what to do?
Well, okay, the first thing, yes, material aid. I'm not going to repeat that.
Mm-hmm.
There's some concrete things you can do. But the first thing we'd have to say, all leftists, all socialists, all fighters for workers and the oppressed must unite in defense of Cuba against U.S. imperialism, regardless of your views of the bureaucracy, of the rulers in the country. Mm-hmm. Similarly, they should be doing everything in their power to mobilize working class action to defend Cuba. I'm not saying it's easy, but as you said, there's a whole history of Cuba inspiring struggles of working people, and especially in the global South. Mass protests, strikes, labor boycotts of military goods are all sorts of things that would be needed. But I would say this is a huge test for the left because, frankly, protests in defense of Cuba in the last few months, since the ratcheting up of threats by Trump, almost everywhere in the world have been pathetically small. Mm-hmm. I mean, especially in imperialist countries. And I think it's actually a criminal indictment of much of the left internationally, not all, but big parts of it, that they've largely given up on active defense of Cuba, or at least don't see it as a crucial task.
What do you mean by active defense?
Even big demonstrations. I mean, I saw a clip of the one in London that one of our comrades got to speak at. It tiny. Correct me if I'm wrong, but London could bring it. Hundreds of thousands in Palestine protested. Mm-hmm. And I know in American cities, it's been the same sort of thing. So even at that level, mass protests, but more broadly raising the issue prominently, trying to mobilize in the working class. Now, I'm not saying nobody does that, but overwhelmingly, the left hasn't been doing that. And I think it's linked in many cases to the fact that much of the left internationally these days has just been, or for decades, has actually been kind of supporting or seeking to pressure to the left a liberal wing of the ruling class in various countries. So in the U.S., for example, that means the Democratic Party. But the drive to overthrow the revolution's always been a bipartisan imperialist policy. It was the Democratic Party that staged the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, that repeatedly tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, that actually introduced and escalated all these starvation blockades. So I think it's impossible to mobilize in defense of Cuba if you're going to look to this party of imperialism and war, or to its kind of analogs in in other countries. Now, there is a wing of the left which has a much better basic position of we're defending Cuba and we want to actively do something. I'm thinking of groups. I don't know the British RCG that well, but there would be one. There's groups like the PSL in the US and some of the communist parties and their youth groups internationally. Some of them had, I know, representatives at the flotilla, and we talked to them, some of them in Havana. But again, most of them, these ones end up giving a blank check to the Cuban leadership. And the issues that I just went into, why we think that's not the way forward. So at a broader level, the answer is anti-imperialist struggle. You can't seriously fight to defend successfully the Cuban Revolution unless you have a perspective of breaking leftists and workers from their own misleaders who tie them to the capitalist order, whether that be the Democrats in the US or bourgeois nationalist governments, especially ones with a progressive veneer in Latin America, like Mexico, Brazil, etc. So I think the fundamental problem is political. There's no easy answer to this. It requires political struggle. But just to go back to where I started on this, it would seem obvious that this is an issue that the vast majority of leftists and socialists should be able to do serious common work on, at least just to defend Cuba against U.S. imperialism. And it's kind of, I think, an indictment that there's rather little of this.
Yeah. As you were speaking, I came across this a couple of days ago. This is a joint declaration of communist and workers' parties. It's titled "Stop the Escalation of Aggression Against Cuba." But this refers exactly to the wing of the left that you were just talking about. So it's a short statement saying that they condemn U.S. imperialism's escalation of aggression, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the end, it says, we express our solidarity with socialist Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm looking at the signatories, and there's a total of 87 communist parties, which, you have the Jordanian Communist Party, the Communist Party of Kazakhstan, the Communist Party of Pakistan, Romanian Socialist Party, the Communists of Serbia. You have all these small communist parties, which I assume are more of the Stalinist orientation. Then you have a handful of other parties. Party of Popular Will Syria. But I mean, in broad terms, I would agree with you that the most elementary thing that the international left could be doing right now is agree on the very minimal united front basis that Cuba must be defended, and how do we coordinate our tasks to aid that defense? Do you think
I would agree
possible?
with that. Well, it should be. Unfortunately, it's only happening on a very limited basis. I do know we coordinated in a number of countries around the Nuestra America flotilla, and also the Partisan Defense Committee raised quite a bit of money for material aid to Cuba, some of which was then donated to other campaigns. That's the sort of collaboration on a small basis that or a particular basis, I think, has happened to some extent and can be built on. But more broadly, you're absolutely right. You get these paper declarations. Okay, it's better to have a declaration than nothing, I guess. But where's the actual activity to do this? And I think that's linked to the politics. If you're not willing to stand up, not just in rhetoric, but in strategy, program, and action to U.S. imperialism and its lackeys in other countries, you're not going to be able to do the serious work to mobilize to actually defend Cuba. Again, I'd come back to the example of Latin America or China. I have not read the declaration that you read, but if people are going to do declarations in defense of Cuba, it should be calling on Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, send oil to Cuba, defy the U.S. blockade, workers in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, demand your leaders do this. And if they don't, organize through your unions to ensure this happens. Leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, the main ultimate target of U.S. imperialism and its drive to restore its world hegemony. Chinese Communist Party leader, you're lying flat, whatever the phrase they use is, and seriously mobilize to rebuild Cuban infrastructure, seriously mobilize to tell the U.S. imperialists, if you go after Cuba, you try to destroy it, we're going to come to their defense. People aren't doing that. And those are the sort of things. I'm not saying that's easy. But that's the kind of perspective that's needed and frankly kind of obvious as the things that can actually defend Cuba. So look, everyone needs to do everything they can for defense of Cuba, for material aid to campaigns and unions, et cetera, et cetera. But the broader solution is it's political fundamentally. A serious anti-imperialist perspective that requires rethinking and breaking from a lot of these policies of what we call class collaboration or appeasement of imperialism and other forces that are directed against the worker and peasant masses.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to add to the list of things that could be done, these days Trump is sliding in his poll ratings.
Yeah.
And one thing that left in the country as well as in the trade unions could be doing is actually fighting within the trade unions for such things as blocking military shipments or all of those things, like fighting the blockade concretely within the US. That would do the most, I could think, But as you also mentioned, the protests to defend Cuba, but not just Cuba. In my opinion, I think the protests to defend Venezuela were also rather small, at least here in London, but from my understanding in a number of the Western countries. So I feel like there is a bit of a ebb in terms of, you had the Palestine movement, which was huge, enormous. But when it comes to the other countries which are under the gun at the moment, it's not the same. And this, of course, intersects where, in our estimation, the working class is in a weak position. Of course, also turning to the right in many, many countries, especially in Latin America. It's overall not a good situation for mobilizing the kind of struggles that we need. As you know, our last episode was on Bolivia, which, depending on how that struggle unfolds, could be a positive thing in terms of, igniting that spark which is needed to build to give courage and confidence to the anti-imperialist sentiment on the continent and in the Caribbean. But last I heard, I think they've given the government a 90-day ultimatum for elections, which could be a move to, bring back Morales, maybe, I don't know. But it seems that movement maybe is also slowly starting to reach its peak. I don't know. But I guess all of it to say that we once again find ourselves in a situation, whether that's Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, where the tasks are urgent and gigantic, but the left is weak and divided.
Correct.
And somehow find myself arriving at rather depressing conclusions in many of these discussions that we have on the podcast. But it is what it is. Also, I mean, I think everybody knows also that this would be a grave defeat. It would make it so much easier for Trump to push through his agenda in the region if Cuba is defeated. But here we are. I think you've laid out the broad outlines of what's needed. And of course, the left being small and divided as it is, I think it's also difficult to coordinate those things. But to those listening, so I think, all we can do is coordinate and push the politics of why it's necessary to defend Cuba at this hour of its need.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I would say depressing, but that's the word you used. Hard realistic is what the word I would use. That it's a hard situation, but it is urgent. If I could just maybe finish on one point, just to point some lessons from the destruction of the Soviet Union. Which
that's actually useful. Yeah.
The biggest defeat the workers have suffered in the 20th century was the destruction of the Soviet Union and East Germany and the other worker states in 1989 to 91. Now, I think we're pretty well known, at least among active leftists, that we were hard defenders of the Soviet Union and its East European allies against counter-revolution, including on the ground in East Germany and Moscow. And we're actually very proud of our interventions there. So how does this relate to Cuba? Well, let's be clear. It was imperialism that destroyed the Soviet Union. It was imperialism that destroyed the East German worker state. That's the main thing. But there's another side to the story. A whole wing of the Stalinist bureaucracies there gave up. They surrendered. They sold out the DDR. They sold out the Soviet Union. So the point I'd make to defenders of Cuba today, that's good. You're actively on that side. How can you be so confident that things will be completely different with the Cuban Communist Party, like a communist party that welcomed Obama, whose perspective in the U.S. is somehow hold on till we can get another Obama in the White House, that is seeking to make a deal with U.S. imperialism, communist party that has been, in our belief, pursuing policies that are increasingly hated by especially younger elements in Cuba, and put everything into tourism at the expense of infrastructure, agriculture, etc. And that's the course they've set for the revolution. And the problem is it's being, I think, concealed by forces that, in the name of opposing imperialism, give a blank check to the leadership. Yes, our task is to fight U.S. imperialism, absolutely. But part of that is a fight to help Cubans who want to defend the revolution, but, hate what's been going on in the country, to find a road forward. So that's kind of the sum up point I'd like to make.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. I mean, it hadn't occurred to me, but lessons of counter-revolutions elsewhere, I think, are important for the left and revolutionaries to be thinking about, to be learning from, in order to figure out what to do and what not to do as we face the growing period of uncertainty. So I do appreciate that point on the Soviet Union. All right. Well, thank you very much, John. I appreciate your time. And okay, bye.
We'll talk again sometime. Bye.
Yeah, absolutely. Bye.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you don't know, but there are just a few of oligarchs and capitalists profiting massive profits, holding us down in lockstep. And your vote, it ain't gonna stop them. Now,